to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Well, this has been a very eventful week in our nation's history, and I'm going to talk more specifically about the events at the Capitol later in the broadcast. But I had already been preparing a program on the concept of the U.S. as a failed state. And it seems all the more appropriate now than it was when I started. Wikipedia defines failed state as, quote, a political body that has disintegrated to a point where basic conditions and responsibilities of a sovereign government no longer function properly. A state can also fail if the government loses its legitimacy, even if it's performing its functions properly. For a stable state, it is necessary for the government to enjoy both effectiveness and legitimacy. Likewise, when a nation weakens and its standard of living declines, it introduces the possibility of total government collapse. The Fund for Peace characterizes a failed state as having the following characteristics: loss of control of its territory or of the monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force therein, erosion of legitimate authority to make collective decisions, inability to provide public services, an inability to interact with other states as a full member of the international community. End of quote. That was Wikipedia. It's necessary for government to enjoy both effectiveness and legitimacy. I think it's fairly clear that our government is completely ineffective, and legitimacy is now seriously in question. The term failed state is often used in relation to nations in the global south or those outside the U.S. orbit. Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan and others have been called failed states. But what about the United States? George Packer, writing in The Atlantic, noted that the coronavirus revealed, quote, a dysfunctional government whose leaders were too corrupt or stupid to head off mass suffering. Every morning in the endless month of March, Americans woke up to find themselves citizens of a failed state, with no national plan, no coherent instructions at all. Families, schools, and offices were left to decide on their own whether to shut down or take shelter. End quote. Tom Engelhardt, writing in The Nation, said, quote, the United States remains the richest, most powerful nation on the planet, but is also afloat in a sea of autocratic, climate-changing, economic, military, and police carnage that should qualify it as distinctly third world as well. You could simply think of us as potentially the most powerful, wealthiest failed state on the planet. End quote. Darren Acemoglu, an economist at MIT, told Vice News recently that there are, quote, 3 big factors that have him worried. Law enforcement failed in its functions of protecting peace and citizens. Bureaucratic expertise is seriously hampered, and the state institutions themselves are unable to check the power of the executive branch. Some commentators blame all these ills on Donald Trump, but he didn't invent them. And while his misrule accelerated the dysfunction of our government, it was, and still is, heading in the wrong direction. So I want to examine the 4 characteristics of a failed state mentioned earlier and see if we agree that the United States is a failed state. First, the monopoly on the legitimate use of force is probably the one characteristic most people think the U.S. government still possesses. But does that stand up to scrutiny? The U.S. Constitution begins by conceding that monopoly through the Second Amendment, which permits gun ownership by private citizens. The founders prefaced that right with the phrase, quote, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, end quote. And until 2008, the courts ruled that this was not an individual right and that states could impose controls on the possession and sale of firearms. But in 2008, a 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court ruled that the language and history of the Second Amendment showed that it protects a private right of individuals to have arms for their own defense, not a right of the states to maintain a militia. And the muskets envisioned by the founders have given way to assault rifles and other military-grade firearms, and the NRA and its followers will tell you that one reason the Second Amendment is in the Constitution is so that citizens could fight against an oppressive government. We learned on January 6th that the supporters of President Trump have no regard whatsoever for the institution of our government or its laws. There is no guarantee that this will be the last such protest, nor that future protests will remain largely peaceful. Another weakening of the U.S. government's monopoly on the legitimate use of force is the trend toward privatization of military and security forces. Private military contractors have replaced U.S. troops occupying other nations, and the job market for private security contractors is very strong. They not only work in the military in lieu of soldiers, but in private security jobs in executive protection, corporate security, and information systems security. Many of our prisons are now in private hands and are little more than slave labor camps. In a crucial situation like that previewed for us at the U.S. Capitol last week, would they obey government orders or side with the opposition? Frankly, that event makes us wonder if our public police forces are actually under the control of the government. I'll have more to say about the January 6th events later in the show. A second feature of a failed state is that there is an erosion of legitimate authority to make collective decisions. Now, here is a BBC News documentary from 2013 that describes this, and some of this is intentional and built into our Constitution, and some of it is more recent in origin.
What on earth is wrong with this town? All the classical architecture in the world can't disguise the fact that in this vital capital, democracy has become a hysterical drama. The puzzle is why the man who lives here, to many the most powerful man in the world, is so often thwarted. The simple answer, Congress. This is a country where sometimes it seems everyone talks and nobody listens. The leader of a divided government in a divided America knows he's often at the mercy of a new breed of activists from the Conservative Tea Party who hate him and all his works. Both sides are loath to blink in a battle for America. A lot harder because in 2010, not only did Republicans win control of this place, the House of Representatives, the victors were a new breed of radicals.
We've got free posters of Sarah Palin and Ronald Reagan.
In a Washington hotel, social conservatives gather for their annual Values Voter Summit. While the name, the Tea Party, is only a few years old, the resentful, righteous right have been a force in America for many years. People who distrust the media and the coastal elite, who believe their country is in mortal peril. The difference now is they've ruthlessly targeted and deselected Republicans they think are too wishy-washy, and instead sent radicals to Washington with the instruction, don't fit in, fight. But the very architecture of American government makes this more of a problem. Designed to keep the slave states on board, used for decades to impose white power on the South, it's wrought specifically to stop stuff happening. Republicans in the House aren't just some raucous opposition, they're part of the government with real power. In most democracies, you don't get the fancy titles and the big offices until you compromise. Here you do. Agreement is based on goodwill. It's a commodity in very short supply. America is not just changing, it's still becoming, with two very different visions of what it should be. When one party is determined to block the other in a place almost designed to seize up, expect rolling crisis. It's better perhaps than civil war, but not a great example to the world.
Again, that was a BBC documentary from 2013, a long time ago it seems. James Madison designed the U.S. government structure in order to eliminate the negative effects of faction, which he defined as a number of citizens, whether amounting to a minority or a majority, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. The permanent and aggregate interests of the community was really defined as protecting property and its owners from those who didn't have any. But serving the interests of the few has to be balanced with some attention paid to the many. That comes about in two main ways. First, the people have some voice in the government willing to fight for their needs, and secondly, that the government has to be in control of the corporations, the economy, not the reverse. After the end of World War II, the United States could have retained the controls and the social programs of the Roosevelt administration and wound down the military and forced the corporations supplying them to retool for peacetime. But instead, a weak President Truman allowed the leaders of the military intelligence apparatus and the major corporations that supplied the military to invent a new enemy, the Soviet Union. Rather than winding down the war industry and reverting to peacetime production, the alleged Soviet menace provided an excuse to spend even more on the military than was spent during the war. Continued influence in Congress by strong labor unions and more responsive politicians kept the lid on for quite some time. And the increase in prosperity during the 1950s was shared between the elites and the workers, and the predations of Cold War politics were imposed only on other nations in the name of fighting communism. The assassination of President Kennedy and the ensuing debacle of the Vietnam War, along with a slowdown in the economy, made it clear that something would have to give. Either the war or the social programs would need to end. It's the famous guns versus butter argument. Obviously, the war did finally end, but spending on the military did not decrease. The social programs of FDR and LBJ were gradually defunded and dismantled, and government regulation of business was weakened, ending with Bill Clinton's so-called welfare reform, his banking deregulation, and the Biden crime bill. And we now have a situation where corporations control the political process and Congress. So much money is available to support or defeat individual representatives and senators that those who step out of line are jeopardizing their jobs. Bills, particularly those that receive bipartisan support, are often written by corporate lobbyists. They include provisions to decrease or eliminate the taxes on the wealthy. They craft clever ruses designed to fool working people into thinking they've won something when they haven't. The Affordable Care Act being a prime example. With corporate interests controlling the government, it goes without saying that the needs and desires of working people are only given lip service. Both political parties are dominated by these money interests, and it's very rare that a candidate, particularly a presidential candidate who doesn't support those interests, can be elected. Donald Trump was the example that proves the rule. He overwhelmed the Republican Party establishment by crafting a campaign based on his false promises to help ordinary working Americans, at least the white ones. When he converted the Christian right to his side, he was able to win the nomination. The Democrats, having gone through the harrowing defeat of George McGovern in 1972, made sure that no upstart populist or anti-war candidate would ever get the nomination again. They used every dirty trick available to quash the campaign of Bernie Sanders and nominated a candidate that no one was enthusiastic about, who got beaten by a reality TV host and con man. Over the last 40 years, we've had 30 years of divided government. That is, that no party controlled both the White House and both houses of Congress. The only bills of consequence that passed were those supported by the big banks, the corporations, the wealthy elite, and the military-industrial complex. Programs to help the workers, help the poor, curtail corporate malfeasance were systematically eroded if not eliminated altogether. Democrats sometimes propose decent progressive legislation, knowing full well the Republicans would not allow it to become law. There have only been 4 years out of the last 40, when Democrats held the presidency in both houses of Congress as they do now. But they still managed to accomplish nothing because there are a handful of their numbers who always vote with the Republicans. We're going to see this in the next 2 years as senators like Joe Manchin of West Virginia will make the Democrats' slim majority in the Senate powerless. Our government is totally dysfunctional. Public services have been the primary casualty of the corporatization of government. Our social safety net is practically non-existent. Our educational system is underfunded and under attack by privatizers, and our infrastructure is crumbling. When some progress is made, it is so thoroughly undermined by the corporate lobbyists that it provides little or no benefit. We are now the only nation among the OECD nations that has a declining life expectancy. Our public services weren't that great to start with, probably owing to the fact that the United States has been at war 228 out of its 245 years. The last characteristic of a failed state is, quote, the inability to interact with other states as a full member of the international community, end quote. Is that true also? I say yes. To be a full member of the international community, a nation must first of all respect and abide by international law. It needs to be a member of the key international organizations like the United Nations and a signatory to the treaties that bind others in the international community. None of these qualities applies to the United States. The U.S. ignores international law unless it can be used as an excuse to vilify another nation that the U.S. has, for no good reason, designated as an enemy. The United States does not recognize the International Criminal Court. It regularly violates the Geneva Conventions, and it charges around the United Nations like a bully on a middle school playground and has no respect for that institution and its work. The U.S. has also rejected many crucial international treaties, including the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, Protocols 1 and 2 of the Geneva Conventions, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the SALT II Treaty, Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the Kyoto Protocol, the International Criminal Court, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, the Arms Trade Treaty, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. That's just a partial list of the treaties that the United States has not signed on to. Those aren't the actions of a nation that interacts as a full member of the international community. They're the acts of a bully nation that demands to lead the international community or it refuses to play at all. In conclusion, I have to agree that the U.S. is a failed state. It's still hanging on to life because it has a huge military deployed all over the world, and its currency is used by most nations as a reserve currency. It used to have the world's largest economy and thus the biggest market, but that's no longer the case, as China has moved into the lead. It seems very unlikely that the U.S. dollar will remain the world's reserve currency for much longer. Once that happens, the military will become unsustainable, and our status as a failed state will be obvious to everyone. I'll be back with my reflections on the January 6th riots at the Capitol after this musical break.
When you're working 2 jobs and living in a tent, when a house costs $1 million and you can't pay the rent, when politicians say they'll help but it keeps getting worse each time the landlord lobby pulls the strings of the purse, when the human right to housing isn't even part of the debate, you know you're living in a failed state. When millions of citizens are spending half their lives locked up in a prison for trying to survive. when laws must be broken just to have a place to stay, when the prisons pay the senators to look the other way. If you have to be a criminal to put food upon your plate, you know you're living in a failed state. When you're facing climate breakdown, when the trees are all on fire, when half the country's underwater, when a climate change denier runs the nation, and the opposition party votes for oil rigs and pipelines, it's not so much a country as it is a corporation buckling under its weight. You know you're living in a failed state. When your nation is an empire facing daily blowback, and the only thing your leaders can think to do is attack, bipartisan consensus that we need to spend $700 billion before the year's end on a military budget to make America great, you know you're living in a failed state. When almost every day some psycho with a gun has to open fire on a crowd before it's done. When a music festival becomes a free fire zone, and all they can say is, it's okay now, he was acting alone. Buy some armor, pray to God, and hide behind a gate. You know you're living in a failed state. You know you're living in a failed state.
And that's David Rovics, who was my guest last week here, from his album Strangers and Friends, the title, of course, Failed State. I really felt I had to say something about the riot, whatever you want to call what happened at the Capitol on January 6th. So, I happened to be writing an op-ed, hopefully, on this, so I thought I would share it with you. On January 6, 2021, thousands of Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol, gaining entrance to the chambers of the House and Senate and many of the offices of the members of Congress. Having achieved that unprecedented invasion and occupation, what did they do? Well, they yelled Trump slogans from the speaker's podium, they put their feet on Nancy Pelosi's desk, they rifled through the desks of senators, and they marched around the hall with flags and wearing horns. What was embarrassingly evident was that they had no plan. They successfully invaded and occupied the halls of Congress, but had no idea what to do next. If that sounds familiar, it should. This has been a hallmark of U.S. foreign policy for the last 70 years. Overthrow governments that don't relinquish their sovereignty to the exceptional nation, invade them when necessary, occupy them, but accomplish nothing of value whatever in the process. The United States never thinks about the consequences of its military actions, never has anything of value to offer to the people whose nations they destroy, and nothing of value to repay the American people for their loss of life and treasure. More often than not, the targeted nation is reduced to a failed state, and the people are much worse off than they were before they were liberated by the U.S. The anger and frustration that has driven many people into the camp of Trumpism has its genesis in the inability of our political system to respond to the needs of the people. Our political parties and their media sidekicks stage a drama in which each postures as being opposed to the other in order to market themselves to the more radical members of their audience. Neither of them is willing to pass legislation desired by a majority of citizens and usually blames the other party for their failure. The two political parties that control the U.S. government can safely ignore extreme voices on either side. The only constituents they serve are the wealthy corporate leaders that shower them with campaign money. The plans behind the legislation and budgets passed by Congress, often with a bipartisan majority, are those of the Wall Street and the corporations that fund political campaigns. If an individual aligned with activists on either side manages to get elected, they are either stymied and blocked by the permanent government, like President Trump, or they're persuaded to vote with the establishment even while they're spouting partisan slogans such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her squad. Meanwhile, the corporate media markets their news to one side or the other and spends endless hours in column inches demonizing the other side. After 26 years of unregulated media, this demonization has rendered the nation so polarized that it cannot function as a democracy or as a reliable member of the global community. Over the last 4 years, we've seen a Republican administration intentionally destroy what little had been accomplished by the previous Democratic administration, and over the next 4 years, we're likely to see the reverse. This isn't governance, it's theater. Progress in any direction is impossible with this seesaw governance. An evenly divided electorate means that neither party will be able to retain control for long. And it means that campaigns for federal office will become more expensive and more corporate money will be solicited to make candidates viable. Bipartisanship, sought by Democrats and repulsed by Republicans usually, is nonetheless quite evident when the matter concerns the wealthy elites. The annual defense budget, the latest war, and anything desired by Israel passes with near unanimous support. The money is spent, the taxes on the wealthy are reduced, and the regulation is weakened with no thought about the impacts of those decisions on the people of the United States or of those nations designated as our enemies. That indifference to the needs and interests of most citizens, coupled with neoliberal austerity, leads to a loss of confidence in politicians and the institutions of national power. Add that to the hate-mongering by the corporate media and the social media environment that amplifies and lends credence to hatred of the other, and you have a volatile situation. Now consider the stress of months of lockdown, the deaths of nearly 400,000 in a pandemic, and pervasive government corruption. Layer on the ravings of a president far more interested in self-aggrandizement than governing the nation, and armed mobs in the streets should be expected. Trump seized the opportunity created by our dysfunctional political system. His excellent con man skills, his willingness to tell people what they want to hear regardless of the truth, and his aggressive style convinced roughly half the electorate that he might do more to help them than a politician closely identified with the sources of many of their problems. Of course, he didn't have the mental or emotional ability to actually lead the nation, or the political skill to make good on his promises, but even after 4 years of mismanagement, most of his supporters remained loyal. Why? Because no viable alternative was on offer. The only Democratic candidate that excited a large number of people promised to address many of the same problems Trump had promised but failed to address. But Bernie Sanders never got the free TV time that was lavished on Donald Trump. He wasn't as flamboyant or outrageous, but he was competent and committed to the policy ideas of his campaign. And that was a threat to the establishment elites both in the corporate and financial world, and especially in the Democratic Party leadership. So in the last 40 years, progressives like Sanders have tried to work within the Democratic Party to move it in a leftward direction, and every year the party has moved further to the right. President-elect Biden is a very conservative politician who had been on the right fringe of the Republican Party not long ago. Why have progressives failed? Because they never had a plan to achieve political power. In summary, we have a right wing that has no solutions to the nation's ills, a left wing that has no political power, and a government that has outsourced its functions to financial and corporate interests. A government of the people, by the people, and for the people has perished and cannot be resurrected. Thanks for listening to Wider View this week. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway, and hopefully we'll be back next week with more Wider View.